Hello, my juicy co-creators. Lilou here from this beautiful capital that is London in England with Graham. Hello.
Hello, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thank you for accepting this invitation to do an interview.
That's a pleasure. It's should be an interesting interval.
Yes, I'm excited to have one of your first book, if not the first book, The Sign. Well, not the first book.
Well, okay, the book that you're holding, which is The Sign and the Seal, A Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant, is the first book in which I investigated a historical mystery. But I had been writing books for quite a long time before that. The first book I ever wrote was in 1981, and it was a travel book called Journey Through Pakistan. In those days, one could travel freely in Pakistan, and I had the good fortune to travel everywhere in Pakistan over a period of 6 or 7 months. That was the first book I did, and then I did some books on more political and economic subjects, such as a book about foreign aid, a critical book about foreign aid called Lords of Poverty.
Yeah, you were working as a journalist for The Economist, huh?
I was a journalist for The Economist. I was the East Africa correspondent for The Economist, and I traveled widely in the African region. I saw a lot about aid projects going on. I had the opportunity to travel to many other countries as well, and I felt that the whole system stank, rather badly, and that it was not helping people. It was hindering development in every possible way. So I wrote a kind of radical, critical book about foreign aid called Lords of Poverty. I think that's probably the unifying theme of my books over the years has been to take an outside or an exterior point of view. I don't take the mainstream point of view. I take rather an alternative point of view. At that time in the 1980s, criticizing foreign aid was a bit like criticizing motherhood. It's not something that one did, and I did criticize it, and I came in myself for a lot of criticism for having done so. But I still believe that I was right. And
to this day, you're still seeing that.
Yes, I believe foreign aid is a huge mistake. I think I don't think it recognizes the sovereignty and the responsibility of the peoples who are receiving aid, and all too often it empowers those who are already most powerful in the developing countries, and does not empower the poor who need to be empowered. Very often, the problem of development is a problem of unequal power within the society, and you're not going to help that problem by making the powerful even more powerful, which is what it does. It gives them patronage, it gives them projects that they can control and manipulate, which the taxpayers in Western countries are funding out of the goodness of their hearts, but frankly it's not doing any good.
The goodness of their heart, I don't know, but there's some obligations too, and at the same time there's society. But I am what I wanted to say is that why you start digging in the history and ancient civilization to see the root of it all, or how did this started really?
There was no such reason why I started digging into historical mysteries. It was just that I came across a historical mystery. In my work as a journalist, it happened that I came across Ethiopia's claim to possess the lost Ark of the Covenant, and this intrigued me. There was something about it which I felt rang true, even though every academic authority I talked to told me that it was nonsense. And in fact, the more the academics dismissively and scornfully told me it was nonsense, the more interested in it I became, because I was aware, as many of them were not, how central the tradition of the Ark of the Covenant is to Ethiopian culture, and how there is a specific location where the Ark of the Covenant is believed to be kept. And it was after I'd first gone there, which was to the city of Aksum in 1982 or 1983, that I started slowly to dig into this mystery and to accumulate evidence and information that further intrigued me. For example, the presence of the black Jews of Ethiopia, the Falashas, who call themselves the Beta Israel, and who practice a very ancient, mysterious form of Judaism. And it's a mystery in itself how they came to be present in the highlands of Africa. And I couldn't help feel that this mystery was connected to the claim that the Ark of the Covenant was in Ethiopia. So it was an investigation for me, which I ran in parallel with my interests in current affairs. But gradually the interest in historical mystery began to outweigh the interests in current affairs. There are enough people working on current affairs anyway, tens of thousands of journalists all around the world, all doing a very good job. And I felt I'd spent enough time doing that, and I got drawn more and more into the past, which is an intriguing place to go, because the past is not and can never be fully understood. If we can never even fully understand another country today, and we can't, how can we hope to understand history and remote prehistory? And this is the arrogant claim that historians and archaeologists make, that they have understood and completely explained the past. And I don't agree with them on that. And it's a plain fact that the further back you go, the less and less evidence you have. And the more and more history becomes a kind of story, becomes a narrative which is being told to us by certain powerful individuals in our society. And I actually have reached the conclusion that history is part of the mind control system that operates in our society. We are given a sanitized version of the past, which is seamlessly connected to our present, and we're therefore supposed to just accept the whole package without really asking any questions about it. And my function has been to ask questions about it.
You're certainly a very courageous soul for doing that and doing this work. I saw, for example, your TEDx video just being removed from YouTube, things like that you must have seen throughout your life kind of be removed, that yet your books are out and selling in millions. So the information is coming out.
They go through, ups and downs. I've taken a lot of attacks and criticism from mainstream academia and from their friends in the media. It has meant really for the last 10 years that the mainstream media don't cover my work because I'm considered to be too radical, too much of an oddball. But this is becoming less and less important because we have this amazing thing called the internet, where people can talk to one another and make their own choices about what they want to learn about, and actively go out and seek that information. Nowadays, the gatekeeper who edits the big newspaper or who controls the big television channel doesn't have a monopoly on information as they did 20 years ago. And so I'm finding a new readership and a new audience out there in the realm of the internet, where I find that people are thinking radically and are thinking for themselves and are seeking to empower themselves with information through their own active endeavor, rather than simply being spoon-fed it by the mass media. So it's been an interesting process to be this person who is largely hated, actually, by mainstream academia. I mean, I've seen historians and archaeologists virtually foaming at the mouth when they hear my name, because I'm considered to be some sort of I don't know, it's worse than a heretic. I mean, somebody who is, they honestly believe, that I'm misleading their students about the past. When students come to them after lectures and say, but what about this possibility of a lost civilization? They don't even want their students to consider that there might have been a lost civilization, because mainstream academia says, no, such a thing is completely impossible. So, I found myself again and again in confrontational situations, and all I can do is go ahead and tell my truth as I see it. I don't even claim that everything I've looked at in the past absolutely has to be a fact. I am just raising questions. I'm saying that maybe there is another way of looking at things. Maybe we shouldn't just accept absolutely chapter and verse what we're taught in school and what the media tell us. Maybe we should engage our brains and look at this information with different eyes. And I've tried to provide to people who are curious in and interested, really interested in the past. I've tried to provide them with ammunition and with data and with logic that helps them to do their own work. Now, the TED thing that you mentioned was very curious and very odd, because I really, when I speak of mainstream media, I didn't put TED in that basket. I thought, well, there were some very exciting and radical and interesting talks on TED. So when they invited me to speak at a TEDx conference, I felt right at home. I thought, this is a great place to to go and explore some extraordinary ideas.
What was your extraordinary ideas during that specific TED?
The specific issue that I focused on was what I call the war on consciousness. The notion that our society idolizes one particular state of consciousness, which I call the alert problem-solving state of consciousness. And while it may allow us certain holidays from that state of consciousness, whether in the form of low-grade reality TV or whether in the form of alcohol, while it may allow us certain little holidays, it basically wants us to remain in an alert problem-solving state of consciousness such that we can be active producers and consumers in the global economy and keep the big corporations, the wheels of the big corporations turning. And my view is that this global economy and societies based upon it is a broken model. And it is not going to continue for very much longer in its present form. And that we've already all seen the evidence for that with the global financial crisis, and it's quite clear that this economic system does not keep its promises, that it lies to us all the time. The illusion of endless prosperity and endless growth, everybody can see that that's not true now. And then there are these horrendous side effects, such as global pollution, such as the deeply offensive destruction of the sacred realm of the Amazon rainforest, such as the fact that our global society, our global technological, much vaunted society cannot even solve the problem of hunger on a global scale, such as the proliferation of nuclear weapons, such as the endless wars and conflicts multiplied by hatred and fear and suspicion that are going on around the world now, and this crazy pursuit of short-term goals, of short-term immediate profits without thinking of the long-term consequences of what we do. I would say that all of these things come from an over-monopolistic focus on the alert problem-solving state of consciousness. I'm not saying that there is no place for the alert problem-solving state of consciousness, because there is. If I get in an airplane, I would like the pilot to be in an alert problem-solving state of consciousness. He needs to be to fly that airplane. But I don't want him to be in that state of consciousness all the time. I want him to be in it when he's flying the airplane. Otherwise, I would think it would be very good for his mental health to explore other states of consciousness. And I raised the rather, I suppose, radical issue that shamanistic societies have something to teach us in this area, because shamanistic societies embrace deeply altered states of consciousness and find them an incredibly valuable realm of teaching from which one may learn important and significant life lessons that help us to be more adjusted and more functional human beings in this world. And I, furthermore, and it seems this was really what caused TED to actually delete my talk from their YouTube channel, I suggested that we don't really know what consciousness is. There is no full scientific explanation of consciousness. We know that it's involved with the brain in some way.
Or not. Most people would say not, no.
I don't think most people would say not. There is a correlation between the brain and consciousness.
It's not fabricated by the brain.
Well, this is exactly the point that I was making. The fact that a correlation exists between the brain and consciousness does not prove that the brain generates or manufactures consciousness. And that is the mainstream paradigm, that consciousness is a product of brain activity. And actually they call it an epiphenomenon of brain activity, almost as though it's an accidental product, that somehow through the process of survival of the fittest and evolution over millions and millions of years, I'm describing the mainstream paradigm at the moment, that we've evolved these complicated brains to survive, to function, and that as a kind of accidental byproduct of that, we've got this thing called consciousness. And it's a kind of illusion, according to mainstream science, and there's nothing more to it than that. Therefore, if you buy into that paradigm, you cannot possibly believe, for example, in life after death. If you believe that your consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain activity, then when brain activity ceases, that's the end of your story. Your consciousness goes out like a light. But the point I wanted to make is that the relationship of consciousness to the brain, to use an analogy, I'm not saying it's exact, but to use an analogy, may be more like the relationship of a TV signal to a TV set. In that case, when you damage or destroy the TV set, the TV signal still continues. So what I'm suggesting is that the brain may be a transceiver of consciousness rather than a generator of consciousness, that it may be what allows consciousness to interface with the material realm, but that it may not at all be producing consciousness. And this is called the non-local model of consciousness, that consciousness cannot be localized to the brain, but is in some sense external to and even completely independent of the brain. And it's a model that I happen to feel has huge merits, and I wanted to put that model across. And this conflicts with one of the fundamental ideas of materialist science, which is that consciousness is simply generated by the brain. And since materialist scientists, and when I say materialists, I don't necessarily mean that they love material things. I mean that they define reality in terms of matter, that everything should be reduced to matter. Just the case that scientists of that type are the principal advisors to TED as to what is acceptable and is not acceptable on their channel. And it was materialist scientists who insisted on my talk, and also the talk of my friend Rupert Sheldrake, that they should be removed. And although our talks were very different, what they held in common was a non-local view of consciousness. So I realized that what we were up against there was actually not science, not reason, but ideology, that this was in fact an ideological dispute that we were engaged with, and that under the appearance of science, what you often find, if you scratch it deeply enough, is pure ideology based not on facts, not on evidence, but simply on deeply held opinions. So a man like
power, and wanting to keep the power.
Well, certainly wanting to keep power, and it is power when you can order a talk to be removed from the internet simply because that talk does not happen to coincide with your views. Of course, again, now we come into the situation in the 21st century where people are thinking freely and independently. To order a talk removed from the internet is not a very clever thing to do. Yes, they got rid of it briefly, but it was downloaded and re-uploaded again onto dozens of YouTube channels and seen by probably far more people than would have seen it if they just left it alone. So they were exercising their power, but the freedom and independent thought of huge numbers of individuals out there frustrated that objective of TED's and actually turned it against them, which I'm very happy about. I was emotionally deeply touched by the huge support that I was given by a wide community of thoughtful, intelligent, free-thinking individuals around the world who just would not put up with that nonsense, would not be dictated to as to what they might know or not know here or not here, and who rightly feel that it's really up to them to make up their minds on the content of a talk. They might not agree with everything I say, and they're welcome not to agree with everything I say, but they shouldn't have it removed from them. They've got to be left to make up their own minds,
With all the research that you have done back in ancient civilizations and historical events and all of it, have you found out that these kind of the population being more and more knowledgeable and these kind of revolutions happening, or this kind of turn in power, do happen to make is it something that happens before such a civilization can really blossom into something that is much more holistic in its view of the world, and therefore can really thrive and be not just materialist, but really understand our whole place in the cosmos?
Human rights struggles have rightly been an important part of the human story in the last few hundred years. We have abolished slavery. There was a time not so long ago, 300-400 years ago, when slavery was considered absolutely normal, and some people were ferocious advocates of and supporters of slavery. Today, it's considered to be abhorrent. And I think we can all see how deeply and fundamentally wrong it is to take away the right to freedom from another person and make them work for you for nothing, which is what slavery is. A grotesque abuse of human rights. The civil rights movement in the United States, where people of color were discriminated against simply because of their color, or indeed in South Africa, until very recently, apartheid. This is grotesque and evil abuse of human rights, which have nevertheless, those who abused those rights strongly argued in favor of continuing to abuse them for many, many, many years. The women's liberation movement has been a very significant factor, certainly of the last century. And again, how absurd, we can see now how absurd and crazy it is to minimize the potential of half the human race simply because of their gender. What a ludicrous and stupid idea. But once it was considered to be absolutely right and proper that women should not have equal rights to men. The gay rights movement, why on earth should somebody be sent to prison because of their sexual choices? It's completely insane. We see that now. But for centuries we were blind to it, and people's lives were made miserable simply because of their sexual choices. So there have been great advances in our society, and we should recognize those over the last, say, 500 years or so. We do recognize largely the right to religious freedom, that people's religious choices are their own choice and their own right. But there's one fundamental human right which we do not even recognize as such in our society today. And that is the right to sovereignty over consciousness. Our consciousness is the most intimate, the most personal, the most sapient part of ourselves. And to live in a society that claims to hold the key to our consciousness and to tell us what we may or may not experience in the inner sanctum of our own consciousness as adults is to live in a society in which it is impossible to be free in any meaningful sense. And it's an absurd irony that Western societies, which go around the world imposing their version of democracy, who confuse democracy with freedom, and who say that we will impose democracy on you, and you, are the very societies which most rigorously punish sovereignty over consciousness. And I speak here, it's a controversial issue, but it comes down, it's a litmus test of the kind of society we live in. If we live in a society that does not allow us to make use, for example, of ancient and sacred shamanistic plants to alter our consciousness, because those plants are defined as drugs or hallucinogens in our society.
Like ayahuasca.
Like ayahuasca of the Amazon, which has been in use in the Amazon for thousands of years, and the use of which is recognized in the countries surrounding the Amazon basin as a fundamental human right. But in the West, consumption of ayahuasca, which means the vine of souls, can result in a prison sentence. And it has indeed resulted in a prison sentence for a number of individuals. This is deeply wrong. We have to be free as adults to make those choices, to choose to drink ayahuasca or not to drink ayahuasca, or whether it's psilocybin mushrooms or LSD. There's a fundamental right at stake here, and that is the right of the adult to make choices about what they experience within their own consciousness. Now, the defenders of the so-called war on drugs will immediately say, but if you alter your consciousness with those substances, you'll become dangerous to others. You can do harm to others. That's why we have to control you. This is complete rubbish. We already have laws, plenty of them, that deal with the issue of being dangerous to others. We've got so many of those laws, and I have no objection to those laws. If we cause harm and damage to others, then I think society has a legitimate role in preventing us from doing so. But what we experience in the inner sanctum of our own consciousness, that is no place for government or the state to go. And if we allow the state to go there, then we are allowing the state to transgress the most fundamental part of our freedom as individuals. And the whole principle of freedom becomes contaminated by allowing the state to do that.
But are we evolved enough in our own society to take use of those drugs? Because when we see how they're used in the environment they're used and with the type of people and the evolve, even though if they walk on the land barefoot, they're actually very evolved in their spirituality and their understanding of the world. So are we really able, though, in our society to handle such a drug? And isn't it something that we can also discover in a more just natural or organic way?
Well,
this
so
unity,
what can be more organic than plants, frankly? Yes. I mean, can you think of something more organic?
Are we a society that can handle it and I will make good use of it? That's my question.
We're a society that needs to learn to handle it. We're a society that urgently needs to develop our own shamanistic tradition. We're a society that needs to honor individual consciousness and allow the exploration of consciousness and to develop systems and structures that make that safe and nurturing and positive. We can never do that while our society maintains a rigid phobia on these matters, where our society is prepared to demonize, to criminalize, to send to prison, to ruin the reputation, to ruin the life of an adult who explores his or her own consciousness using these extraordinary agents of consciousness change. We will never get it right while we continue down that road. As far as I'm concerned, the so-called war on drugs is one of the most vicious, the most evil, the most cruel tyrannies that has ever been practiced in the human story. This year and every year, more than 750,000 Americans are arrested for smoking cannabis. Arrested. They get a criminal record. Okay, they may not all go to jail, but they get a criminal record. Their reputation is ruined. Their job chances are reduced. Their life quality is seriously damaged simply for making the choice to smoke a herb. This is not freedom. We cannot claim that we live in a free society, and I believe that the freedom of the adult to make those choices trumps everything else, and it's more important than any other issues that might be raised. Now, yes, as a society, we have a lot to learn about how to handle these powerful plant agencies. We have a lot to learn about how to handle them, but we will not learn that in the present climate. We can only learn it if we lift these restrictions and allow exploration to take place. And you know what? At the moment, even though there is a war on drugs, all of these substances are available. They're just available underground. It's not that the war on drugs works. I mean, if it really worked, if it actually did achieve its stated objectives, then its advocates might have something to say. I wouldn't agree with them, but they might have something to say. But it doesn't work. It's a miserable failure. And what it results in is more harmful and more dangerous drugs constantly coming onto the market. It's just not a success at all. The perfect example of this, of why actually we need to trust our citizens, we need to empower them to make choices rather than force them to make choices. The perfect example is what has happened with that powerful addictive drug called tobacco over the last quarter of a century. What has happened with that powerful addictive drug called tobacco is that the consumption of tobacco has radically decreased in the last 25 years. 25 years ago, there were smoking compartments in trains. You could smoke on airplanes. Every car was sold with an ashtray. Smoking was very normal and very widespread and undoubtedly very harmful to health. We never, at any point, sent people to prison or ruined their lives and reputations for smoking cigarettes. What did we do instead? We provided good information. We said, look, if you smoke a lot, you're likely to get cancer, you're likely to get heart problems, you're likely to get respiration problems. The evidence is very clear. Why don't you as an adult just think about it and see what you decide for you? I know what I did when I stopped smoking cigarettes in 1988. I stopped because I accepted the information. Nobody forced me to. Nobody threatened me with a jail sentence or the ruin of my reputation. I was just provided with good information, and I made a rational choice as a sovereign adult that I would stop smoking cigarettes. And the result of that rational choice, multiplied by millions of individuals, is that smoking in the West has radically declined in the last 25 years. The same is not true of the illegal drugs. The drugs that will result in you being sent to prison and your reputation ruined, like cocaine, for example, their consumption has vastly increased in the West in the last 25 years. So it's a no-brainer, really. It's perfectly obvious. If you want to discourage the consumption of a drug because it is actually dangerous, just provide sovereign adults with good information that they believe, and they'll make the right choices. Mm-hmm. You don't have to send them to jail.
So going back to the consciousness and the spirituality, what have you found as part of those ancient civilization that actually, because I saw you mapping with the Milky Way and the sky, some positions over, I know this is a conversation that you went many times into, but I'm wondering, because you just came back from Mexico well, some time ago, but you wrote the War God.
Yeah, which is Graham Hancock as a novelist these days. I'm known for writing non-fiction, but for the last 5 years I've started to write novels because I think that fiction is an interesting way to explore extraordinary ideas. You know, in a novel you don't have to provide 2,000 footnotes. You can tell a story, a good story that people are drawn to read, but between the lines of that story you can embed intriguing and exciting information without having to consider that an army of furious academics will be knocking at your door claiming that you got this little fact or that little fact wrong, or you didn't put it.
I get your anger.
I want you to put it.
I get it. But so you started doing fiction books after your experience with ayahuasca yourself. Yes. You did a book called Entanglement.
Well, first of all, ayahuasca is one of a number of shamanistic plant medicines that are used by shamans around the world to enter a deeply altered state of consciousness, what you might call a trance state. Peyote in North America, southern parts of North America, the peyote cactus is also a shamanistic plant that is used to enter altered states of consciousness. The San Pedro cactus in the Andes, psilocybin mushrooms, all around the world, have been used in shamanistic ceremonies. The unifying feature of shamanism is altered states of consciousness. That's, if you want to take a single definition of what shamanism is about, it's about the management and control of altered states of consciousness to acquire information of value to one's life. That is primarily what shamanism is. And if somebody says they're a shaman and they don't enter an altered state of consciousness, then I would resist that. And I would say, well, that person is not a shaman. That person is something else. Call themselves something else, please. Don't call yourself a shaman if you're not using altered states of consciousness. By all means, visionary plants are not the only route to altered states of consciousness. The Bushmen of the Kalahari use a dance. They dance around a fire for often up to 24 hours at a time, until they sense their spirits leaving their bodies and entering this other realm that they call the spirit world, which is a very interesting issue in itself, because the spirit world is the other universal feature of shamanism all around the world. Fasting, sensory deprivation, put yourself in a dark, closed cave for a few days, and you will start having visions. Now then we can have the discussion, as we could with the plant medicines as well, whether those visions are anything real or whether they are simply the product of your brain. I happen to think that they're extremely real, but that's an argument. That's something that needs to be proved, and we're not in a position to prove it one way or another at the moment. So it's as though actually nature has taken, what I would call a belts and braces approach to allowing us many opportunities to enter altered states of consciousness. Nature has provided us with these bounty of sacred plants that allow us to enter altered states, of which I include ayahuasca. And ayahuasca is not one plant, but two plants. It's a brew made of two different plants from the Amazon, and either plant on its own is not effective. They have to be cooked together to produce the powerful psychoactive effects of ayahuasca. Now, I first got involved with ayahuasca back in 2003. Prior to that, I'd had very little experience of psychedelics, apart from one almost accidental, spontaneous trip with LSD in 1974 when I was 24 years old, which I enormously enjoyed but did not wish to repeat. Apart from that, I'd had no experience with psychedelics. I'd had quite a lot of experience later in life with cannabis, but cannabis is not rightly defined as a psychedelic. It's something else. But psychedelics themselves, almost no experience until 2003. And the reason I decided to go to the Amazon, seek out shamans, and drink ayahuasca with them was first and foremost for research. I was writing a book that became, it's in fact the last non-fiction book that I wrote, called Supernatural, Meetings with the Ancient Teachers of Mankind, which begins by exploring a mystery. And that mystery is the universal features of rock and cave art all around the world. Why is it that the San of southern Africa 8,000 years ago were painting figures that were essentially identical, and patterns, essentially identical to the figures in the painted caves of Lascaux or Chauvet in France? How do we explain this? Certainly these two cultures were not in contact with one another. Not only are they separated geographically, but they're separated by thousands of years in time as well. How do we explain these universal features? I wanted to understand that, and I came across an academic theory of which the main exponent is Professor David Lewis Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, by no means the only, but the main exponent, which is that the universal features of rock and cave art may be explained if we understand that those who painted them were shamans, and that they had entered, as all shamans do, altered states of consciousness using various techniques, and that what they were depicting were the characteristic imagery of deeply altered states of consciousness. That's why it's universal. So when I discovered that there were shamans in the Amazon who were drinking a powerful visionary brew, and who were subsequently, when they returned to a normal state of consciousness, were painting what they remembered of their visions, it was obvious I had to go and learn about this. I don't believe in sitting in an armchair, and I will not let ideological issues get in the way of what I regard as direct and important research. So I went down to the Amazon, and I drank ayahuasca with shamans there. I had 11 sessions of ayahuasca in the Amazon over a 5-week period on that first research trip. And the experiences were very extraordinary and very, very powerful, and in a number of ways that surprised me, because it wasn't simply entering a seamlessly convincing parallel realm inhabited by intelligent entities who communicate with you telepathically. It wasn't simply that.
Which that's what Supernatural was about, huh?
Well, I was trying to get to grips with these universal features of supposedly unconnected cultures all around the world. But what I discovered was that the universal features may indeed be explained by the fact that they're all going to the same place, and they're depicting what they see there. Now, whether that place is real or whether it's a projection of the brain, that's an argument that we could have and that remains to be settled. But it's the universal features of the art are explained by the universal features of the experience, and amongst the universal features of the experience is what we can refer to as entity contact. And actually, I would challenge people. There are a lot of people I've met who object to altering consciousness using plants. They feel somehow that it's improper or impure or a shortcut, that we should do, decades of meditation, or we should fast.
Maybe it's just not their calling. I think there's many different paths.
I think there are many different paths, but I have to say that I found a judgmental tone on this. I do find that people who, for example, strong advocates of meditation, it's not just they say meditation is for me, ayahuasca is for you. They say meditation is right, ayahuasca is wrong. They actually put it down. They put these agencies down and even suggest all kinds of harms and dangers that may come from using those agencies, even though they themselves have never in their entire lives used such agencies. There is an instant knee-jerk judgment that takes place. I can simply report that to you as a fact of my experience. It's happened to me in audiences when I've talked about this. People have stood up and objected to it. You told me that it's impure and improper to use plants, that it's a shortcut, that you're not working hard enough, you have to do the hard work. So I don't agree with any of that. Everybody, as you say, everybody has a different path and what works for them. But what I would say is that these visionary plants are enormously effective at bringing about this experience of entity contact, of contact with another, an intelligence which is not human intelligence. It's something else that we're dealing with. Now, this itself is a very interesting issue. And if we were a more open-minded society, it would be possible to do some scientific inquiry into these entity contacts and what actually is or isn't going on here. Because one of the great advantages of the visionary plants is that you can literally turn that experience on when you want to. You know, it's not something that you have to get a room full of meditators to sit and just hope that one of them starts experiencing encounters with entities. You can very reliably and systematically produce that experience and allow that, and then you have the opportunity to explore and investigate that experience and really find out what is going on. I'm intrigued, for example, by the work that Dr. Rick Strassman did at the University of New Mexico with another powerful visionary agent. In fact, it's the active ingredient of ayahuasca. It's called DMT, dimethyltryptamine. Dimethyltryptamine is one of the two principal ingredients of ayahuasca. And dimethyltryptamine is normally not accessible orally. If you take it orally, it does not produce an effect because of an enzyme in our gut called monoamine oxidase, which literally switches off dimethyltryptamine on contact. So people in the West who take DMT, they smoke it. And that produces a very rapid, very short-lived, extremely powerful visionary experience, which lasts about 12 to 15 minutes. In the Amazon, they have done something really extraordinary, which is they've worked out a way to make DMT orally accessible. And that's by mixing it with the ayahuasca vine, which contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which switches off that enzyme in our stomachs and allows the DMT in the leaves, the other aspect of the brew, to become orally active, and produces not a 15-minute journey, but a 4-hour journey into deeply altered states of consciousness. And it's a really rather fascinating thing. So I initially went to the Amazon purely for research reasons. I felt I couldn't write about this without experiencing it myself, and that I would probably be able to shed more light on it if I did experience it myself than if I just read about it. But what I experienced was so extraordinary that I felt it was worth continuing with the investigation, and that it also became a spiritual work for me. Because I found that I was getting life lessons from ayahuasca. They do regard ayahuasca as a teacher in the Amazon. They speak
of she. Most of the people that took it say she. Is that seen as a god, as a soul, as an entity, as a
kind of goddess,
connected to the world
to the planet Earth. The mother goddess of our planet would be the way I would put it. And again, I emphasize, I cannot prove to you or anyone else that this entity who have worked extensively with ayahuasca have come to call Mother Ayahuasca, that this entity exists at all. She may be entirely a kind of collective fabrication of our minds, but I don't think so. The view that I take, and it comes back to this issue of the locality or not of consciousness, is that the brain is a transceiver of consciousness rather than a generator of consciousness. And that therefore it is possible to alter the receiver wavelength of the brain, and whole areas of reality that are normally closed off to our senses can be made accessible to us and to our consciousness, and that we can then interact with the intelligences that are present in those other areas of reality. And that's why I mentioned Rick Strassman's research with DMT. Now, he was using pure DMT, not ayahuasca. And to overcome the enzyme issue, he was giving it his volunteers were not smoking it. They were receiving it as an intravenous transfusion. And they were not comparing notes, but many of the volunteers started reporting contacts with the same entities. And several of them, and to me this is very intriguing, were told by those entities, "We're so glad you've discovered this technology. Now we can communicate with you more easily. This to me is a very intriguing issue. Is there? Are we literally seeing reality through a glass darkly, as the saying goes? And if we can cleanse that glass, is there so much more of reality we can see and interact with in a nurturing and positive way? I don't deny that there are also dangers. There is good and evil in this world, and I believe there is good and evil in the realms beyond as well. I think that this polarity of good and evil is one of the fundamental issues of our level of reality at the moment. I want to be very clear on what I'm saying here. I have a friend, James Tipton in the United States, who's got a nice phrase for this. He calls planet Earth a university of duality. This is not to say that duality is everything. Not at all. It's to say that there are certain lessons to be learned from duality.
Learning from contrast.
We're learning from contrasts. And actually, at this particular level of development, duality has a lot to teach us because it requires us to make choices. And I think most people don't really realize this or think this through, but just about virtually every minute of every day, we are constantly making choices. Sometimes very small ones, sometimes very huge ones that affect large numbers of other people, between good and evil, between dark and light.
Between love and fear.
Between love and fear. Is exactly what I was going to say next, between love and fear. We're constantly making these choices, and these choices define us, and it is by these choices that we grow or shrink. And that is a very useful gift that this university of duality is giving us. Because if we didn't have to make those choices, what responsibility would we have? What opportunity would there be for growth? Now, I'm not denying that there may be realms beyond this realm where all is one and it's all goodness and light, and that perhaps we aspire to and reach that. But right now, we have a lot to learn from duality. But anyway, the duality exists in the material world, and it also exists in immaterial worlds that are not accessible to our senses. And therefore, when one opens the door to those realms, one opens the door not only to angels, but also to demons.
Is that based on our own perception of life that we have those experiences, or shamans and people really living in this unseen world and that are used to it also have this experience? Because it seems like when I speak to some spiritual teachers, they're like, there's no such good or bad. It doesn't really. It's not like dark or light. It's what it is, and then it's what you make of it that is the challenge.
They're quite possibly right about that. I don't put that view down. I happen to have my own view, which is
we say that it's bad for us, but in the end, that same challenge in our life, disease, job loss, or divorce, or whatever, can be exactly the most supportive thing.
Important lesson. But look, I mean, if we make choices that add to the misery and the suffering of others, which infringe upon the sovereignty of others, which reduce their life chances, okay, I would say we are making a choice for evil. I would not say all is one. I would say that the individual and many individuals make those choices, many governments make those choices. When a government sits down and invests public money in creating drones that can go and massacre whole villages because they're trying to catch one guy that they disagree with, they are infringing with wickedness on the sovereignty of every one of those villagers. And this is not an act that is morally neutral, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
The
same way then in Mexico there was massacres. So you saw that, you see that as a demonistic...
I think it's an interesting idea to explore.